Morning, everyone. The reason for the picture of the badger is because I feel as rough as a badger today. So we'll just, I'm just going to pick off a little topic and then we can go through some general questions as well, because there's quite a lot happening actually. But I wanted to focus on what the Tories may be doing out of sheer desperation when they're looking at polling, which if they can't proceed with, I mean, there's all sorts of things that could affect the polls. We know about voter suppression in the form of voter ID. We know that depending on when they hold the election, it could make it awkward for students to vote. Their campaign could be incredibly effective and incredibly dirty. But I just wanted to have a little look at what they may be doing with their potentially last chance to try and influence the public. And it's in the Daily Mail and the Daily Express, they were reporting on a report, funnily enough, that says that Labour's low carbon net zero plans aren't feasible, or it costs this much money and so on. And first of all, let's go through the sort of nonsense of it. First of all, it's a report produced by Policy Exchange. Now, some of you may know that name. You could whisper it in the same breath as the IEA, for example. It's a Tory think tank, very opaquely funded. You don't really find out who's funding them. But in the case of Policy Exchange in particular, they often come out with reports that seem to be funded by the fossil fuel industry that, surprise, surprise, attack any moves towards low carbon energy. And they've done the same thing here. And it's been cheerfully promoted, these articles in the Daily Express and the Daily Mail, by Tory MPs, including Claire Coutinho. Now, she is the Secretary of State for Energy. So she is a cabinet minister, so very senior member of the government, and indeed the senior member of the government who should be overseeing our own net zero plans, something the Tories, although they attack them, insist that they're proceeding with. And she also has worked for Policy Exchange before she entered politics. So she knows them very well. In fact, she was a senior researcher for Policy Exchange. And then, so you look at these claims and you think, so first of all, I could go on about the fact that, what they will do, all sorts of economic, if you're talking about spending plans over a period of 10 to 15 years, which is what we are doing, then there's all sorts of assumptions will be made, because realistically, you can't actually predict what's going to happen to the economy, what's going to happen to your GDP over a 10 to 15 year period, because some of the policies and spending plans you put in place will grow the economy. And therefore, it's almost like if they provide that return before the 10 or 15 years is up, then it's like it cost you nothing, or it might not work, or it may not give as good a return as you thought. So there's various assumptions in there. And that's brilliant for people like this, because what it means is they can base their assumptions on the low carbon unfriendly side. They could say, oh yeah, you probably only get this amount of benefit and it'll cost, they'll inflate they'll put the cost on the upper limit of what they can mathematically justify. They'll put the benefits on the lower limit of what they can mathematically benefit. If you were to look at this with like error bars on it, it would always be right at the end of the error bars in their favor. However, the claims are so ridiculous that we do not even have to go on about how this is an opaquely funded ultra-capitalist think tank batting for the energy lobby, specifically the fossil fuel lobby, because even their own figures actually back up Labour's plans. So let's go through, what the main claims were. So what they're saying is, in fact, what a different Conservative MP said is, oh, look, this report says that these plans will cost 116 billion pounds. That's funny, because Labour said 28 billion. It's actually costing way more. They're not very good with their figures. However, this is not true, because the actual report, the Policy Exchange report, claims that Labour's spending plans will cost 116 billion pounds over 11 years. The other thing which is 10.5 billion pounds a year, by the way. The other thing to consider is Labour never said that anything would cost 28 billion pounds. The 28 billion pound figure was how much they were allocating for low carbon investment a year, not over 11 years, every single year. And that wasn't in there. Not all of that money was allocated because it was basically going to be a fund so that if any suitable low carbon projects came to light, there would be a fund ready to support it. That was the idea. The actual amount of spending plans, would you like to have a guess how much they came to? Labour's own spending plans, according to Labour, have a little guess how much they came to. £10.5 billion a year, which is exactly what this policy exchange think tank are claiming. So they're claiming that Labour's spending plans add up to exactly what Labour said they would. Also, another couple of things about this £10.5 billion a year. So bear in mind that Jeremy Hunt just issued about £20 billion worth of tax cuts in the last budget. That doesn't include, I don't think that includes the national insurance cut from January. But even if it does, that's £20 billion of tax cuts, the vast majority of which are going towards people who are on high incomes, some of them very high incomes. Now, if instead of Jeremy Hunt just simply cutting these taxes for everyone, if he'd said instead, look, okay, there's people on low incomes could really do with some more money, and there's plenty of people who are sort of okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to arrange tax breaks, not tax cuts, that will benefit those on low incomes, low to median incomes, say. That way, ordinary workers could have benefited. If he'd done that, he'd have had more than the £10.5 billion a year, because the tax cuts, remember, it's £20 billion every year. And if you shrink your economy, it'll be more than that. So he's basically saying that he can afford £20 billion of tax cuts. If he just targeted people on low to median incomes, he could have had the £10.5 billion to invest in this net zero himself. Alec Barrett, £2 super chat. Thank you very much. Says, we got PV in January, 34.5% of E has come from PV. What? You'll have to excuse me. My brain is not in a good place today. I'm quite ill. You may have to say what that is. Do I spot a touch of something in my right eye? Maybe. I am ill. I mean, often it is anyway. It's just because of the lighting. But solar panels. Sorry, I've got you. Energy. I see. I get you. Yeah, solar panel energy. Thank you very much. So, well, I was talking about solar power yesterday, in fact, in terms of the sort of farmers' protest. But ultimately, I mean, the other thing to look at it is you've got, if you're reliant on fossil fuels, you're reliant on you're reliant on geopolitical stability. I mean, this was part of Rachel Reeves's speech last week, the Mays lecture. She said in it, you cannot base an economic model on the assumption that you have geopolitical stability, because right now it's not even like you go for 10 or 15 years and then something blows up for a couple of years and then you go back to stability. She was saying it's increasingly ridiculous to suggest that we can have any economic model that's based on that. And yet that's what the Tories want to do. And when they say, oh, but the oil and gas goes for the North Sea, that's ours. No, it's not. The government, neither the Scottish government nor the Westminster government, are exploiting any oil or gas from the North Sea. It's all international private companies, and they sell it on the international market. So we basically pay for it as if it was being excavated from French territorial waters or Danish. Makes no difference that it comes from UK waters. We pay the same price regardless, the international price. And obviously, when you have a war that disrupts oil or gas supplies, as we have, then the prices go up because supply and demand, and you end up paying more for it. Whereas if you have a bit of a problem like that, your solar panels will still work. I mean, okay, we need some earth metals and so on from parts of the world that we'd rather not upset. which is interesting because we're upsetting China right now. That's a good one. But nonetheless, the actual solar panels will still be fine. The wind turbines will still be fine. Where we can build hydroelectric, we've only got limited places to put that, but that will be fine. Tidal, anything like that will be fine. So yeah. The other thing, before I move away from this policy exchange report, because it goes on about all these Tory MPs go, oh, this is going to be 160 billion pounds of extra spending. And it's like, no, it's not. Actually, it's not. Because the same report says that the Conservatives' own plans come to 104 billion in the same time period. So Labour's plans cost an extra 12 billion. They're more likely to work because they don't involve shoveling money into private investors who will then just chuck it offshore. We also get an energy company out of it. And we move towards lower carbon energy more quickly, because what the Tories have been doing with their plans is to curtail them. They've slowed down. In fact, they've been slowing down since 2010, let's be honest. But they've slowed down and they're working on the assumption something magical will happen to still be on target. They're not on target. They weren't even on target before Rishi Sunak announced his policies last year. But there we go. So what I think's going on here, basically, I think the Tories, like, they can't know. I mean, it's possible that their dirty tricks will help them become the leader of the the official opposition party. Maybe they will win 200 seats or maybe 160. That is enough. You know, they'll rebuild. That, you know, you need to properly crush them to stop them rebuilding. And even then, it's not guaranteed. There'll be a lot of money behind them, unless that money decides that Reform UK are just as good a bet, maybe. So, yeah, I just think what's happening is, because there is a possibility that the Tories could be bereft of influence after the next election, they're desperately trying. Their scorched earth policy includes trying to attack Labour's spending plans as much as possible, you know, to get the public to turn against them. But I think they're going to struggle because the Tories have lost a lot of credibility, and also Labour can't afford to be boxed in too much. Like, if Labour fell for all of these traps, they're going to have to sound a bit coy up until the election. But if they actually constrained themselves too much with all these obvious Tory traps, they wouldn't actually be able to stand on any sort of record at the following election. Tories hate renewable energy. Well, they don't make as much money out of it. Doesn't really cost as much. For example, when when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, our energy bills went up, doubled. In fact, well, domestic energy bills doubled. Business rates went up way more, and that was because the price of gas increased. Price of solar didn't increase. Price of wind didn't increase or anything like that. It was only the price of gas that increased. And because energy prices are fixed at the most expensive form of energy, which is gas, or specifically fossil fuels, then that meant our energy bills had to double. Yeah, Alex saying again there, a third of our electricity has come from solar in January to March, which is not traditionally the sunniest of times. In winter, excellent investment indeed. And also we should have more. So, you know, I did a video yesterday talking about the fact that, the government are not placing much value on farming land, agricultural land. So we are, British farming is, and there was a large protest in London yesterday, which actually did get mentioned in more news outlets than I expected, actually, because it's on the BBC as well as Sky, which is good. But one of the problems is that the Tories don't value agricultural land, so it's worth more as something else. So for people who own agricultural land, it's worth more to them to use it for something else, right? And but what we should do is use much more small scale energy. Like in fact, in 2010, I was, and for several years afterwards, I was actually teaching about renewable energy at college. I was teaching a course, And we used to analyze the use of small-scale energy, which includes, of course, solar panels on roofs. If you've got a roof, like obviously that's, south-facing or roughly south-facing, and you don't have a solar panel on it, it's a bit of a waste. But the government, removed the sort of incentives for people to put them on their homes, but they should be on businesses as well. We've got a lot of spare land effectively where you can stick a solar panel, and that, it's not like you're then unable to use that land for something else. You just stick it on a roof, stick it on as many roofs as possible that are like roughly south facing. How many Tories on the boards of electric companies? Could be quite a lot. Could be quite a lot. And also a lot of these energy companies are, of course, state-owned, which is marvellous, isn't it? State-owned, absolutely marvellous. Only it's different states that own them. None of them are owned by the UK. Labour's plan is to introduce Great British Energy as part of this £10.5 billion a year investment. That'll use up a few billion of it a year. And the idea is that they will promote the use of low carbon energy. And any sort of returns they get, goes to the Treasury. Whereas, so you look at this 116 billion. So let's say Policy Exchange have got their figures right, because in actual fact, you know what? If they were going to make up these figures, I'd have thought they'd have come up with much bigger figures, because these sound very affordable. 116 billion pounds for Labour's plans, as opposed to 104 billion pounds for the Tories' plans. And the Tories' plans all have that public money going into private hands. Labour have some of it going into public hands. And because Labour also are going to have a policy of public money being prioritised to companies, businesses who treat their employees well, so it's not on a pure cost return basis. Labour are going to prioritise businesses that run more ethically, for example. So we're going to get way more benefit from Labour's 116 billion pounds, if that is indeed what it comes to. And we'll get returns on it. So actually, it won't even come up to as much as the Tory spending plans. It'll be more effective. It'll be of more benefit to society and workers. And it'll end up net costing less. What the Tories will do is what they always do. They'll talk about these plans. Oh, we've got these plans. We put this investment in. And the investment ends up somehow at the Cayman Islands. And then what they'll do is a few years later, when the promised returns don't appear, they'll just scratch around for someone to blame. Because if the Tories remained in power, we're never getting to net zero. Not going to happen. Are there any figures for what percentage energy we could generate by installing PV on every viable roof? Not that I've seen, in all honesty, no. I don't know. It's quite difficult because you'd need someone to survey every roof, wouldn't you? Or at least come up with a reasonable estimate, which I'm not sure how straightforward that would be. Because, again, you can't just stick it on every face of every roof. It needs to be roughly pointing at the sun. The media will rip Labour to bits. Whatever they do, management of expectation will be key. They are managing expectations really quite well. It's really remarkable just to consider how bad a state the Tories in. Because if I'll probably do a video on this again on my own channel later on. If you think about where the Tories are at the moment, the polling is absolutely dire. And I don't just mean the polling gap that you all see when you look at a poll. That's the surface polling. If you look under the bonnet, Dylan Difford, who's absolutely brilliant, he's produced some more little charts, tables, which ranks the polling for both Labour and the Conservatives over election years where the government changed, but also election years where the incumbent government won a large majority. And what you find is in every single one of those years, whether the government changed or the government won big, the losing side had some areas that they excelled in. So even in 2019, which was the worst general election result for Labour, I would say, ever. Some people say in terms of number of seats since the last time they lost power, but they'd lost power. They'd been in power and then, they hadn't satisfied people's intent, and they lost. So, I mean, it's not as bad to lose a load of seats. I mean, it's not ideal because it means the Tories are back in, but it's not as bad to lose a load of seats when you've just won power as opposed to when you've been in opposition for 9.5 years. Like, it should be easier. The longer it goes on, it should be easier. But, you know, the 2019 Labour Party had some areas where the public thought they would do better than the Conservatives. Now that's not the case. The Conservatives are behind on not just the overall voting intention, but on every single individual component of it. You know, they really are in a. Someone in the Financial Times was writing. One of their commentators was writing. Basically they were saying, what did the Tories think? They came to power by chasing after the median voters, basically the centre. What did they think would happen if they started to run away from those median voters and towards themselves? He said, what did they think was going to happen? He didn't say this. I would say this. They got away with it in 2019 because Labour did the same. And the Tories therefore benefited from a couple of things. First of all, being the incumbents does help you with a lot of people who think better the devil you know. And secondly, a media machine that was way more effective than they were. So, yeah. But they're not going to get away with it this time because Labour haven't retreated to themselves. They've gone after voters. And in fact, the votes they're winning is like incredibly efficient. Incredibly efficient. The only thing that can stop the Tories really being wiped out is a few things. First of all, people who are willing to vote, not everyone's willing to vote tactically, of course, but those who are willing to vote tactically, not realizing that actually in their seat it can work. So some will just say, oh no, it's too safe here. I would if it was a closer contest somewhere. It is. It's a close contest everywhere, right? Or anywhere where the Tories can reasonably win. Other things, voters, the voter ID issue, that could potentially disenfranchise up to 2 million people. Holding the election when university students have gone to university but without enough time to register there, and in the hope that university students won't organise themselves to register at home, because that's the information I would urge all university students to do. Register somewhere. So if you are currently at university and you want to vote at university, register there because you can do that now. But if you're not going to university until next year, register at home. It's probably better to register at home anyway. Real Gurgly Kiss. I don't know what that is. Sorry. I don't even know how to pronounce it right. £5 super chat though. Thank you very much. I know how to pronounce that. Do you think the 4-day work week can come back to vogue with Labour? Is it something we can expect to be systematic in the near future? So I don't know about near future. What I can say is it's really, what I will say is, again, picking up on something Rachel Reeves said last week. She said the problem, well, she cited multiple problems with our economic model. And one of the ones she cited, and she did not exclude the last Labour government from this as well, is it doesn't provide security. And she specifically cited the rise of technology, particularly AI, as something that disrupts labour markets and provides a more one-sided distribution of wealth. So what is the solution? Because that is true, isn't it? There are going to be more jobs that can be done through technological advances without needing people, which means unless we create whole new industries that need people that machines can't do, you're going to have fewer and fewer people who are able to work or find work, or at least find decent work. What are you going to do? Now, I don't expect Rachel Reeves to instigate UBI, but what I would say is the natural trajectory is something very like it. For example, consider the poor buggers at Port Talbot, right? The coke oven's now stopped, so the blast furnace is next, and even though the arc furnace will employ some people, it won't be as many. And from Labour's point of view, they did not want it all closing down this early. They wanted to make sure that the alternative industries have been built up first for those jobs. They're currently trying to say to the company, look, we will basically compensate you if you don't sack all these workers. And the company's basically saying, no, we're not interested in that. So you could argue in a situation where a load of people are going to lose their job because the local economy suddenly has fewer jobs in it, because market forces suddenly take a load of jobs out of that local economy. would there be a case for some form of UBI specifically under that circumstance? So it's not technically UBI, it's just BI, isn't it? It's not universal. But where people, rather than just unemployment benefits, which are crap, maybe a training fund which gives people a decent, basically a median income or something in return for some skills updating training, something like that. But that's what I would say. If you listen to Rachel Reeves's speech, there was a lot in there that you think to yourself, she's identifying problems here. And as I say, one of the problems was security built in. Port Talbot is a classic case. That is a classic case of where our economic model is letting those workers down, which is what she said is the problem. So what would Labour do? That is the interesting thing. I suspect they won't say this side of the election. But the fact that she's willing to talk about, and she's not, remember, Rachel Reeves wasn't giving this speech to workers or unions. She was giving it to financiers and academics, bankers. So, you can't imagine that they're going to be drooling over plans to provide security for workers, can you? They want to know what security is there for them. Blue Badger's there saying, I approve of the name. I tried to do the maths of how much the UK was built up and how many panels per property. It's enormous potential. It absolutely is, because you only have to drive down any street to know that we are missing a lot of potential for small scale solar. Small scale wind is a little trickier. That tends to be for more remote areas, right? But small scale solar, we are heinously underusing it. Absolutely heinously using it. Curian, £2 super chat, thank you, says, will I be talking about Freeport scandals? I don't know whether Graham is intending to. I may or may not. I mean, it's like the Freeport scandal will get a lot more interesting potentially after May, but certainly after the general election. So really, the weeping sore of Freeports, I mean, they're all just basically ways of funneling more money into the hands of private companies and imposing more slavery on the rest of us, right? But the real weeping sore is the Teesside Freeport, or investment zone, as they call it. Now, on May the 2nd, mayoral elections, Tees Valley mayoral elections. It's very likely that Ben Houchin, or however you pronounce that, guy's name, is going to lose, and there's going to be a Labour mayor who will have access to the books, you would imagine. But then after the general election, you will then have, in all probability, a Labour mayor of Tees Valley, is it? And a Labour government in Westminster. And there is absolutely no reason I can think of why it's in Labour's interests to not open the books on it. Because they know full well it's a load of crap. But there we go. But yeah, going back to the 4-day week, things like this are inevitably going to happen. I mean, if you look back at the changes to the Labour, like working patterns in the last 100 years, so the idea that we're stable now is ridiculous. Of course, we're not stable. So inevitably there will be. And usually it comes as a result of a critical mass of people demanding it, right? So the first thing we need to do is to encourage people to realize that they can actually demand more. They can demand more. Not by the way, saying we demand through a megaphone to like 3 people, but people can use their votes to demand better. Join a union, and then you're part of automatically a larger organization anyway. I'd recommend everyone join the most appropriate union they can. And then with Labour's New Deal for working people, you will have a much bigger voice. I mean, I would recommend. I would recommend the union that is most powerful within your sector or your workplace. But if you have a choice, maybe choose the one that's more focused on improving your rights than student politics as well. CISMA, £5 super chat, another name I'm struggling with. When it comes to possible House of Lords reform, what would be the difference in keeping it while making it elected and scrapping and replacing it? The problem, there's numerous problems with the House of Lords, but if I was to just name one, because we're sort of run out of time, and I'm going to have a lay down, I'm afraid. If I was to suggest one massive problem with the House of Lords as compared to an elected assembly, it's that it's not distributed around the country. Most peers live in London. Not all of them, but they're not evenly distributed around the country, let's be honest. And actually, if you think about it, because the SNP don't ever accept peerages, because they could recommend people for peerages and they don't. So, you know, you've got parts of the country that are left out because certain parties don't want to engage with it, which is entirely down to them. But just naturally, it's mostly people living in London. Whereas if you had an elected chamber, instantly it's distributed around the country, isn't it? There are other advantages as well, but we'll have to leave it there because I have a little lie down because I'm very ill. But thanks very much for coming on, everyone. Have a great day. Don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to the channel. And until next time, I will see you later.